Hello everyone and welcome back to JJ Reviews. It has been a very long time since I last did a video and I am sorry for that. I have had a lot going on behind the scenes. I've moved house, I've had a lot to do, so I am sorry, but here we are at last. We're here with Clonelord, the second Fabius Bile book, another absolute winner on the Black Library Circle. Fabius Bile, great character. And we're back again today painting Fabius Bile himself. So a bit of an unboxing. Again, to start with, exciting, isn't it? It was really exciting last time around, and this time we've got one which is partly painted. This is always fun to see. And what we're going to do is we're going to leap in to the review, and we're going to get down to painting good old Fabius Bile today. Clonelord is the second book in the Fabius Bile trilogy, set a few centuries after the first. Fabius is renewed and is back on the look for more alien artifacts for his own research. As a side note as well, time does travel quite weirdly in these books sometimes. They do have hundreds of years in between book 1 and book 2, which does happen quite a lot. But it's cool. Imagine if the Harry Potter books did that. See Harry at 150 years old. Be great. When Fabius, not Harry, when Fabius is approached by an old comrade from his former legion with a new proposition. He finds himself embroiled in the ambitions of his former brothers, and Fabius has to take the lead on a new mission to find a treasure from his legion's past, accompanied by these former brothers turned unwelcome allies. His new handler, a warrior by the name of Flavius Alcanex, and his subordinate, Paulos Gear. Also, as a side note, it is nice to see Josh Reynolds this time has made the names a bit shorter. If you remember my feelings about the Radiant King in his Joyful Repose from the first book. Moving on. These two immediately get to work on finding potential allies and turncoats within Fabius's ranks in order to undermine and eventually usurp his command and finally bring him to heel. Clonelord also introduces a few new characters and established ones from other Warhammer installments, including the Horus Heresy. I don't want to spoil who some of these old faces are, but let's just say it's quite a comprehensive list. There are a few similarities to Primogenitor off the back, in terms of the setup. So both books have treasure hunting as a big part of the story. The difference is Clonelord, the treasure hunting is more personal to Fabius and to his former brothers in the Legion, which did leave me feeling quite empathetic towards their mission and desires. Like I said in the last review, Fabius Bile used to be a member of the Emperor's Children Legion, which he very much deserted to go his own way, and he's very much been roped back into this family-turned-army, or army-turned-family, depending on how you look at it, and has to work with them again. So you can imagine the whole thing starts off being pretty awkward when they have to ask him for help after they spent a long time hunting him. It's an interesting read from the very beginning, and like in the first book, there is a fair bit of intrigue, but the intrigue develops in front of you as you know who all the players involved are and what they all want, which is pretty exciting and kept me reading. Also, Fabius himself is different. As I mentioned in the last review, Fabius has had to clone himself over and over and over again to stay alive. In the first book, the body he was in was failing and becoming less useful. In Clonelord, Fabius is renewed in a new, younger body, giving him a new energy that keeps him fresh, but also consistent with the character from the first book. He even talks a little bit about how different it is to be in a younger person's body, albeit his body, again the second time round, which is quite interesting to know what it's like when you've been an old man, and still an old man, I suppose, because he's about 10,000 years old, but suddenly he's in the body of someone who's only a few hundred years old. I feel that Space Marines have a different idea of aging than most regular people do. Clonelord is also more introspective of the Emperor's Children Legion as a whole, and for me, being a fan of the Horus Heresy and the Legion in general, there was a bittersweet nostalgia at seeing some of these characters back, but also seeing how they've changed. What is really interesting, and quite tragic, is that a lot of the characters within this book are quite self-aware as to how far they have fallen, and that is present in their actions. This wonderful little quote from the book, an observation from Fabius. Many had etched oaths into their companions' armour. Once such a thing would have been mere tradition, now they were a harsh necessity. A legion of hedonists could not trust itself, and so the wary and pragmatic swore by the 600 names of Slanesh. To break such a vow would court the wrath of the Dark Prince. This really does give some insight into what the Emperor's children have become, that their warrior culture built on brotherhood and self-improvement has given way to the need to swear by dark powers just to avoid being stabbed in the back. It is quite sad. It's worth, of course, noting that the Emperor's children aren't the only ones in this universe to have suffered this way, but it's a rare occasion to see it expressed so openly. Most of the support characters from Primogenitor have returned, along with a few new faces. Igori and Arian, who I mentioned in my last review, are back. Both become key players in Fabius' ambitions this time round, making them more interesting and more integral to the stories. It has to be said, it's quite exciting to see how the new and old characters rub up against each other throughout the story, and it does give that lovely sense that we are adding and contributing here, whereas I do feel that occasionally in the past you'd get books which were so set on who the characters were before we started, and it would very much stay there, whereas Black Library as a whole seems to be more open to adding new voices both to the existing canon of the characters they already have. It's interesting to see how Black Library are now adding more to their canon. In the past, it always felt like they were happy to use the few locations that you'd see in the codexes and read about in other materials in a vacuum, and all the novels took place separately. Whereas now we see a crossover happening more frequently, and as a result, we get this really interesting mix of characters who have models, like Fabius here, and characters who only exists in the books. And that's a really good thing, in my opinion, because it does mean that these people become more interesting and they become people. Anyway, it does feel like everyone is on a more personal journey from the first book. There is also a surprisingly heartfelt theme of parenthood running throughout this book. As in Primogenitor, Fabius is surrounded by his creations, some of whom he does refer to as child, but in this book it becomes more prominent. It's actually quite refreshing seeing Fabius thrust into this role, and certainly gives the book some flavour, and I won't spoil how this manifests itself, but it is one of the things which makes the book worth reading, in my opinion, and it does give it a bit of an emotional sincerity and a heartfeltedness you don't really see that often in novels about gigantic super soldiers. It does feel like everyone is on a more personal journey from the first book. One of the most tragic parts of the book is the wants and desires of all the characters are so closely aligned. It's only because of a few simple and sadly fundamental differences that really set them against each other. That bittersweetness I mentioned earlier becomes even more pronounced when things change during the book around a pivotal moment that, again, I will not spoil, and it has the power to bring everyone together, and we start to tread the line between hope and despair. When you read the book, you'll understand what I mean by that, and what it does to these people in it is something very profound, even in a Warhammer novel, and you don't see it very often. Now, having said all that, there are a couple of shortcomings here. The first one is the much slower pace than the previous novel. It's a shame because the big moments feel cathartic, but it takes much longer than it needs to get there. As a result, some parts towards the end do feel rushed, and I was left a bit bewildered at how abruptly events sped up and then ended. It cuts itself off very suddenly. It does cut itself off very suddenly, and that is a bit of a shame. I also found that on some of the side plots, they were taking up too much space. Now, some of them are integral to the story and do make the book richer for it. However, there are a few that feel a bit unnecessary and pad out the overall length of the book, which is a shame, because I feel there was plenty in there already, and what was explored pretty well. It didn't need to add a few extra bits into it, but they're in there. Another nitpick criticism I do have, and take this one with a pinch of salt, is that Clonelord does spoil some of the events of the Horus Heresy in terms of who survives. Now, the Fabius books are not the only ones to do it, and there are characters who have been around since before the Horus Heresy series was novelised, so that's your Abaddons, your Erebuses, your Luciuses, your Aramans, Typhus, and for those of you who don't know who any of these people are, I may as well have said any group of names, but those guys are all quite interesting, and do look them up, because most of them, I believe, have their own books now, and there is a character called Typhus, not just, the plague, which has been around since, I think, the 14th century, I think. If anyone knows when Typhus first appeared in the world, leave it in the comments below. However, it is a blessing and a curse to see characters who have roots in heresy in these books, as that series isn't finished. And it does mean reading them now takes the stakes down a bit, as we know certain characters will survive. Or, they will, because we know Fabius is a clone, so there could be others out there who were cloned after the heresy. But having said all that, it does still mean that going back and reading other books, and this isn't a review for the Horus Heresy, but it is books like these where we have characters that don't have models and haven't existed since the early 90s, before the Horus Heresy, who, when we see them in these books, we are then left feeling a bit disappointed knowing that whenever they turn up in the heresy novels, we know they're going to survive in one form or another. Now, we need to talk about the strengths. To contrast the points that I just made, the greatest strength of this book does lie in its tragic elements, and it breaks my heart to see these characters are so lost, but are still so driven to try and make something of their situation. And it has to be said that this humanization does go a long way. Just to be clear, I am aware that they are still genetically engineered murder machines who kill millions of people this war to protect. So, it is a swings and roundabouts relationship, which are incidentally two things a Space Marine probably couldn't get on. Back to the strengths. Another strength of this book is its thoughtful deconstruction of what being a fallen Space Marine actually means. It shows what being a renegade living in ignominy actually does to the Space Marines and how they feel about it. I talked a little bit earlier about that self-awareness, but it is actually a really interesting thing hearing them talk about it. And it shows you a little bit how they've always been portrayed in their own codexes and the background knowledge of it. And I think it's important to point out that they're not all the same. They don't all have the same goals. Because some of them are seeking to rebuild the old legions as they were. Others just want to wallow in their decadence and lose themselves into whatever vice they have picked up, which is really interesting as a contrast, because you see some of them who are a little bit more forward-thinking and are trying to get themselves back to having a purpose in life, whereas others are quite happy just to sit back and let the world keep moving around them and try and just bury the tragedy that's happened to them. The reason I highlight it as a strength is because it adds a richness to the world this book takes place in. I say world, again, demon-infested cosmic hellscape, but it continues the fantastic journey of discovery for Fabius Bile and his fellow Space Marines that serves the story whilst expanding upon the people who live in it. I'd also like to add that by developing its side and support characters more, it allows them to take on more of a life of their own within the book, and they become more a part of the main story. Now, I know that I did say it was a weakness that there were so many side plots, and I still hold on to that, but where the stronger support characters actually become more pivotal to the story and develop themselves, that does quite a lot to serve the novel and to serve the book as a whole. Another big strength about this book is Fabius Bile's own inner conflict. I haven't said much about him so far because this book focuses more heavily on the Legion than last time and has far more to do with the people around Fabius. But what is about him is far more to do with his own doubts and uncertainties. In the first book, by contrast, he was very assertive, always felt like he was in control of the situation, and was absolutely certain in his motives and his actions. Here we see doubt, we see him warring with himself, and we do see a side of him where he is uncertain at times and even expresses it. And I won't spoil why that is, but it does give us a very interesting insight into Fabius's mind when it is in this state, and it does leave you anticipating what will happen if he gets it wrong, because it's the first time where he himself wonders, could I get this wrong? Meaning that whenever Fabius is in front of you, you're always eager to see what he does next. So, to conclude, do I recommend this book? Absolutely. Yes. I also feel that this particular book, interestingly, could be read as a standalone. I say this with the disclaimer that you'll need to be well versed in the 40k lore to read this as a standalone, and I would still recommend Primogenitor first, so you can really get to know Fabius and understand his motivations, who he is, what he wants, and why he's doing what he does. Overall, it's another strong book that raises the stakes on the first one, and it does build on the successes of Primogenitor to explore new ideas and themes, and it is a satisfying story from beginning to end, and it's well worth a read. And the other thing about that is that there's still another book in the series, which I will be doing a review for soon, and it does make me want to keep reading to see what Fabius does next, because this book is a little bit more exhausting than Primogenitor. A lot more happens, and a lot more big events happen. It feels like they've scaled up, and they've moved forward, which is really good and really exciting, and it makes me want to read Manflayer even more. Well, there we have it, a bit more progress on today's Fabius Bile entry, and I hope you have enjoyed this review. As always, tune in next time for when we will finally finish Fabius Bile and glue him and his little mate Dennis together. Like and subscribe, and I will see you next time, friends. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day wherever you are. Bye.